So we went through the blueprint of how I build my PHP dev environments, and we started talking about one of the reasons you haven't done that is because Docker on Mac is an interesting experience. And unfortunately, because we are PHP developers, these differences hit us a little bit harder than other programming languages. Well, except for JavaScript, because that's even worse with node modules. But let's talk about Docker on Mac. Now, Docker on Mac is really, Docker's behind a bit of a brick wall. Because in the background, Docker's actually firing up a virtual machine and shoving all your stuff into a virtual machine and running it on there. Your containers aren't running natively on MacOS, on OS X at all. So that means, excuse me, when requests are coming from the host into Docker, a lot of them are hitting this brick wall. And Docker don't exactly help with this. Out the box, Docker for Mac is completely firewalled off is the wrong phrase. It's completely inaccessible from your host operating system except via the Docker CLI tool. There's no networking bridge between the two. There is a workaround for it. I will make sure that's online. Somebody sat down and worked out a reproducible set of steps that will actually create a network bridge between your host and your Docker container so that the DNS that we've showed you earlier will work. Those instructions work. I've tried them out as part of the prep for this, because I actually don't use Docker on Mac at all. But I tried them out. They do work. They are reliable. Eventually, I'm sure Docker will sort this out. But Docker seem to think this isn't possible, even though someone's done it. So don't expect Docker to sort this for you anytime soon. So once I got all this working, I thought it'd be nice to do some benchmarks to compare the two. Because Docker for Mac does have a reputation, and I first used it when it still ran in a much heavier virtual machine in the background before they found the new hypervisor they use. So I took this MacBook Pro. It's a fully maxed out late 2006 model. I'm not going to say it's the best money can buy, but it's the most money can buy. And I pitted it against my Ultrabook running Linux. Yeah, that's not a fair fight, is it? You've got a $4,000 monster against a cheap Ultrabook, relatively cheap Ultrabook. And the numbers stack up. It's not a fair fight. Those are millisecond response times along the bottom. So machine A, I'm getting 19, 20 millisecond response times, which is annoyingly slow for me. Machine B, the exact same request, about 150 on average for the same thing. And those are requests that are loading PHP code, they're going and connecting to a database, they're pulling data back, and they're returning it as JSON. They're not exactly CPU intensive. Now then, thing is, machine A is that Ultrabook. That crappy little Ultrabook with 2 CPU cores absolutely smokes Apple's finest. Yeah. It's ridiculous. It's utterly ridiculous. That shouldn't happen. This machine is way more powerful. In single-threaded performance, it's about 26. If you go on the different benchmark sites, about 27% faster is what the benchmark sites say. But it's got a higher turbo speed, and it will sustain it for longer. So if you're doing a load test, a stress test of any kind, or you like got a functional test suite that takes 10, 15 minutes to run, this machine will should absolutely murder the Ultrabook. But it doesn't. And it's not the hardware's fault. There are massive bottlenecks on Docker for Mac. And the bottom is file access. Those volumes that I mount in, they are the bottleneck. CPU stuff's fine. So if you connect to a MySQL and do some queries where allow MySQL to have its in-memory cache pre-warmed, they'll return just as fast on both platforms. It's file system access is the problem. The interface that Docker has, that OS X gives them, the kernel gives them, between host and that hypervisor is massively slow. Really is a problem. How to solve it? Well, the problem is, there's things out there like Docker Sync, which will copy your files into the container and pretend they're in 2 places at once. That doesn't work for me because I'm mounting volumes into my containers because I want my containers to write to those volumes so I don't lose what they're writing. So I'm still going to have a bottleneck caused by those writes, regardless of my PHP code being loaded in. So I can't win on that. So my solution is to go to Linux. I'm sorry. Because Docker is a Linux native technology, end of the day. More accurately, containers, or LXC, which is what Docker's built on top of, the file systems that Docker uses in order to do the distributions, they are all Linux native, first and foremost. Docker is an application built on top of these technologies. And then when it comes to OS X, what they have to do is boot Linux in the background in order to run all this stuff. And that's the problem. Windows is going to be the same. But it's interesting what Microsoft are doing on Windows, because they paid Ubuntu to port parts of Unix, parts of Linux's kernel, to run on top of Windows. Did you guys see any of that? So if memory serves, and I could be wrong, it was originally a port designed to allow Android apps to run on Windows. And then they realized they could, no one cared about running Android apps on Windows. There was no money in that, and they weren't protecting any sales with that. But obviously, Azure versus AWS is the big business fight today in tech. That's ignoring Facebook versus Google. When it comes to server hosting, it's Azure versus AWS. Or rather, everyone's trying to stop AWS just stomping all over everybody. And Azure, of course, is primarily used by Windows folks. You can run Linux on there, I believe. Never done it, but I believe you can. But if you're going to run Windows, you'll probably pick Azure first, rather than AWS, because it's all Microsoft. So obviously, they want to be able to run Linux on there and everything just work as well. So it's going to be interesting to see how much of that Docker can make use of going forwards. I won't be finding out. I don't run Windows. I'm celebrating 11 years of being Windows free, except for a little games machine and a test box I can't get rid of, but hey, yeah. But this is the problem. On OS X, they're forced to run in a virtual machine. Apple really needs to step up here. Apple needs to help Docker out and give them the native APIs they need to make it a seamless experience. I'm not sure Docker can solve this on their own. I'm sure Docker are making their own problems. You go trawl through Docker issues to find workarounds like the one I showed earlier. You'll see contributors to Docker who may or may not be Docker employees. It's hard to tell sometimes on GitHub, but there's certainly people who are able to comment and close issues. And you don't see the Docker folks understanding why the rest of us are going, please fix this, please make this happen. There's a bit of a gap there between the communities they work with and those of us who are out here writing code and making money for our own firms. There's a bit of a gap there. But I'm sure one day it'll be sorted, which would be great, because Linux is a terrible desktop. It's an absolutely awful desktop. And I say that having run a Linux distribution. So, but yeah, my solution was I switched to Linux for all my dev work. The experience there is fantastic. All the promises of Docker, they are all met on Linux without fail. They are not met on OS X. Not necessarily the answer you wanted, but I had colleagues. Yeah, I can tell this story. When I first started using Docker containers, everyone was on OS X, including me at the time. And my colleagues who weren't contractors like me, they couldn't change the hardware they were using because it was supplied to them by their employer. Now, I'm the boss of my own company, so if I want to change hardware for a project, as long as the budget justifies it, I can spend that money. It's my decision. So I switched to Linux when we went to Docker containers for this particular project. They stuck with OS X. The amount of time they couldn't ship code on time because they were fighting with Docker on Mac. It was slowing down test runs, it was crashing if we had containers that were doing too many writes to the container, that sort of thing. They'd reboot their Mac and then have to go through the whole process of setting up the networking again. Not the Docker networking, the bridge between host and the guest. It became an absolute ball ache. They must have lost 5–10% of their time trying to just to Docker on Mac issues. Whereas I was just carrying on shipping code. I had no issues whatsoever. 0 time lost by Docker on Linux. I can't think, in the last 2 years, I can't think of any single incident I've had with Docker on Linux that's cost me any time at all. The only time that's gone into learning how I want to use Docker, which isn't the same thing at all. But I've had 0 problems. So for me, who bills out by the hour, that's worth a lot to me. And it's worth putting up with Linux and its crappy desktops. So yeah, I switched to Linux. Sorry. Yeah, it works really well on Linux. But hopefully one day they'll sort it. That's it. Thank you very much.